Thank you very much. That was a very, very interesting session. And I suppose that one of the things that becomes very clear is that COVID-19 has caused cases of discrimination, but also that discrimination and disadvantage has impacted disproportionately on people who are poor and disadvantaged. And so it's a very important point, I think, that we have heard there. Now we're entering the section that we have allowed for free discussion. One of the things, we've got 20 minutes. So could I ask you, please, that if you have a question, please start writing it into the chat box, and we will work through the questions as they appear. And while you're thinking of your questions and are writing them up, we've tried to put together a very brief summary of some of the themes that we think have emerged throughout the discussion of the papers in this conference. Now, of course, you'll see that this has been done on the trot, as we would say, because the conference is still going on. And so it may be incomplete and imperfect in many ways, but let me run through them to give you a chance to write your questions if you have any more. So one of the themes was a question about whether to declare a state of emergency or not. And we saw that different countries took a different position on whether they would declare a state of emergency. And also, it seems that sometimes countries didn't declare a state of emergency, but relied on other legislation which was akin to an emergency power. For example, Canada. And I'm sorry that Sebastian had to leave us because it was very late at night. So that is an initial question, and some of the issues that arise is what are the different consequences that occur if a state of emergency is declared. And yesterday, I think Yuyun's very interesting paper looked at this question in terms of different health outcomes, in terms of different governance outcomes. And it may actually be that declaring a state of emergency doesn't necessarily have huge impacts in terms of health outcomes. But I think it does have impacts in terms of governance outcomes. Then we have discussed in a number of different contexts the question about when is the suspension of citizens' fundamental civil rights justified? And I think that this question was approached both substantively and legally. Sometimes a legal authorization to suspend civil rights may be in place. But the question is it appropriate to do it in that circumstance? Which brings us then to the role of the principle of proportionality, because that's not just a legal proposition. It also, I think, impacts on what people are willing to accept, because if people feel that it was substantially disproportionate, then maybe they're less willing to accept it. But the principle of proportionality too, I think, is important in terms of whether we actually declare a state of emergency or not, as well as the ways in which powers are exercised under that state of emergency. We had several papers that talked about the relationship of the emergency to the use of military power and the role of the army, as well as its impact on the criminal justice system. And so I think that one question that also comes out of this discussion is, should we distinguish between health emergencies and other types of emergencies? Is there something that is distinctively different about a health emergency that means that we should think about different types of principles applying than other sorts of emergencies which may be military or other types of emergencies. So that's, I think, some of the ideas that came out about the preliminary question of whether you declare a state of emergency or not. And then we went on to the next question, which was the relationship between executive power and human rights. And there are many questions here, but some of the basic questions, I think, about in what situations and on the basis of what principles should the state be permitted to derogate from fundamental human rights. And we talked about the idea that rights aren't absolute, but that doesn't answer the question about in what circumstances should we derogate from those rights and to what extent. We had quite a lot of discussion about the idea of emergencies becoming permanent, and so what might be acceptable if it was a temporary derogation, we have to think again if it becomes a permanent derogation. We also thought about the idea of what's the appropriate balance between the use of coercive powers and voluntary mechanisms, how to determine whether the exercise of powers used in emergency situations is necessary or proportionate. There was a very interesting discussion yesterday about the role of information in terms of what information does the state give to people, and also how does it control information? How does it stop fake news? And then the very important question about who decides whether something is fake news or not, which is a question of power as well. We looked at the idea of how to balance privacy with the need to track and monitor COVID cases. And we looked at other rights such as land acquisition and the question of discrimination. And I think that the question of discrimination came up again and again and again throughout this conference, talking about the consequences of regulatory choices which may discriminate against certain groups of people, about the responsibility of the state to either minimise or address those sorts of issues. And then in the latest session, we looked at the idea of the fact that the discriminatory treatment of some people, such as migrant workers, in the case of Singapore, has actually led to terrible consequences for those people. So it's both a cause and an effect type of issue. Then we looked again at the proportionality and the legality of actions. Is it constitutional? Is legislative authorisation required? And this question came up in several times in relation to the Vietnamese situation. And also proportionality and legality in terms of from a popular point of view. And finally, I think we had another very interesting theme, which was the relationship between government and citizens. And Paula sent an interesting chat, which I've copied in full because it's her brilliant idea, is that throughout this conference, are we seeing actually that what's happening is polycentric government? That is, we need to have the involvement of multiple regulatory actors. So from the individual to families to local villages, governments at different levels, NGOs, as well as government working together and working in different spheres in order to effectively address the pandemic. And so we see that in a crisis, even though we might think about the response as concentrating central power, maybe what we've seen emerging from this conference is a consideration of the fact that central government power is never going to be enough. So then the question is, how do we engage with individuals and families and communities to make those responses effective? And finally, on that topic of the relationship between government and citizens, we have a question that has arisen about the appropriate balance and the relationship between government and different levels of government, and between government and community actions. And then I think another thematic question that arises is, how do the measures that the government has adopted contribute or build popular acceptance of those measures? How do the measures actually elicit compliance from the people instead of defiance from the people? And then that relationship in turn, how does that affect the perceptions of the nature and severity of the pandemic itself? So these are a set of themes, I think, that I'd like to sort of raise with you in a tentative way. And now maybe we can move to our questions. There was one question which was posed privately, I think, to Mr. Sinapan, and it was just a question of clarification that I would like to read out. It was a question about what proportion of migrant workers in Singapore have COVID-19. And the answer was, it is 90% of migrant workers in Singapore, with 40,000 people infected. And now there's a question from Jonathan Lieberman, who would like to ask or comment on where the right to life and the right to health feature in our thinking. So we've tended to focus on the limits that governments impose on civil and political rights, but measures that are effective in preventing the spread of COVID can also be seen as promoting the right to life and the right to health. Could I ask Jonathan to elaborate on that comment, please?
Yeah, I think it's. I feel that it's quite common in not just in our conference, but I think in a lot of the discussion about the responses to COVID, we're focused very much on the restrictions that governments are imposing on us, as we should be, and they need to be justified. But I often think that public health is removed from the equation in some ways, where when we focus on the civil and political rights, we're taking for granted in some ways that there's a pandemic and government is doing something about that, and we're not thinking about the government actively intervening to protect our right to life and our right to health. And I think it feels to me that it's uncommon for people who, and I think take in Australia, for example, where I think we've done pretty well so far, I don't see people who haven't got COVID out there thanking the government for all the measures that they put in place that limited the spread. And not just people who didn't get COVID themselves, but whose families haven't got COVID yet. So I think all of the effectiveness of the health measures it's taken for granted, and I think we're missing something in the weighing up.
Fabulous. Thank you very much for that comment. Now I have a question from Hahador, who has a question, a follow-up question on labour and employment. How have employers and workers interacted with each other and responded to the impact of COVID-19 pandemic? How have the government and other social actors discussed, viewed and responded to the needs of labour and capital during the pandemic? To what extent and how have labour law provisions such as those relating to retrenchment relevant to the way that employers, workers, the state and others manage the impact of the pandemic on business and employment? Can I turn that question to some of the panelists in our last panel on workers and the economy? Do colleagues from Vietnam have a view on how these issues work in the context of Vietnam?
I think those three questions are excellent and very critical, and we need to have more time to look into that areas Thank you for your questions.
Thank you very much. The next question I'll read out is from Golis and Manti. So my question to all panelists here, may you share how the awareness of citizens in relation to the decisions made by the government, what the situation is about the awareness of citizens in terms of government decision making. And then can you say something about how that information will assist people to support the government in its countermeasures? Could I turn the question on this one back to our Vietnamese colleagues at first instance, please? So about government information, how do they communicate the decisions and how does that influence people's willingness to comply? Jonathan, are you there? Can I pick on you?
Yeah, sure. I think some of us might be smiling because your dog is just absolutely loving this conference. You could just see that he or she?
He, upside down.
Yeah, no, he's very happy. I think this is a really important question. And I'm just, I know I'm starting some work with some of our colleagues in other parts of the university, so outside of the law school, who are doing empirical research, looking at the ways in which people's behaviour is changing as a result of COVID and the kinds of things that are influencing their behaviour. And I think what we've found, partly because the laws have been introduced in such a hurry, that there hasn't been the usual time for any kind of public consultation or even to prepare a public communication campaign that goes with it. And so it was really interesting. So some of the research they did at the early part of this project was with people who were required to go into quarantine or isolation when they were returning home to Australia from overseas. And they were asking them what led them to comply or not to comply. And many of them just it became clear, had no idea what was actually expected of them, and were told things like, use your common sense. So I think feels to me this is one of the enormous challenges in a pandemic in particular, in trying to communicate to the public what the law is. And also, I think there's often confusion between what the law is and what the other things that governments are asking or recommending them to do are. And the last thing I'll say is I think probably what I've realised through this is that many of these questions are not just about pandemics. It's just that we're thinking about them about pandemics. That many parts of the population, I think particularly more vulnerable groups, are often in this situation where they don't actually know what is required of them, but then the law is being enforced against them.
Yeah, thank you. That's very good. And I think that Paula would like to make a comment as well.
Thanks, Sarah. I think one of the issues is in these types of emergency situations is about how much information is given to the public and what that information is. And so this balance between sort of a full account of what is happening and also understanding how the public will use that information, which I think is partly embedded in Jonathan's comment, and so not causing hysteria in the population. And so it is quite a balance for governments to be open and honest and not to suppress information, but to also provide information in a way that is constructive and helpful to people in terms of understanding what they need to do, which also goes to the means which are used. And so understanding that different parts of the population receive information through different media, and so ensuring that populations are actually reached through different media. And finally, in populations that are very multicultural, ensuring that communication is done in multiple languages, including recognising where there might be low rates of literacy as well, to ensure that none of those pockets in our population miss out on important information from the government.
Yeah. Thank you very much. Thank you. Now, I have a written post from Professor Tsuji, whose internet connection is bad. And so let me read it to you, because I think this actually is a really important point on this topic as well. I think that public health now is working like a magic word. It enables the government easily to restrict human rights. So if we get together without any legal restriction, society prospers as a whole. The problem, as Jonathan suggests, is that if we rely on non-legal regulations such as custom or culture, the free rider issue may arise. That is, the people who don't follow the government orders get a great financial profit. And I think that in the Japanese context, we've all heard of the example about the pachinko parlors who were asked to close. And the ones that didn't were identified to shame them, actually. But in fact, everyone who wanted to play pachinko rushed to those ones to play pachinko. So they got a benefit from not obeying the directive. And so there's a very interesting balance here between ensuring public health and helping people to understand and comply. But then you'll always have some people who take advantage of that situation for their own profit. So that's an important point as well. Now, I see that we've actually reached the end of our discussion session. And it's been such a fruitful conference that I'm sure that there are so many other questions that haven't been fully discussed. Could I please encourage you to think about this conference as the beginning of a discussion, rather than the end, to reach out to the colleagues who've raised important points that you would like to discuss with them, and also to send us anything at the Asian Law Centre that you would like us to put up on the website. When the recording is available, we will post it online, and that means that you will be able to look at it at your leisure and to go back to the parts that you found were particularly interesting. And in closing, for myself, can I say thank you to all of you for your participation. We've had a marvellous collaboration with Vietnam National University. I'd like to thank Catherine Taylor and Debbie Yu from the Asian Law Centre, who've been the ones who've been making all of this go. And I'm sure that you've all written to them over time. And now can I turn over the final responsibilities to Professor Vu Kong Zhao from the Vietnam National University to do the final closing address. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Sarah. With the authorization from our Dean Associate Professor Nguyễn Anh, allow me on behalf of the VNU School of Law to once again to express our sincere thanks to all of you. To add the author for permission to publish the paper in the conference proceeding book in order to provide it to the National Assembly and Government of Vietnam for their reference purpose in drafting a law on the state of emergency of Vietnam in the near future. So I would like to express our deep thanks to Melbourne Law School and Asian Law Centre, and especially Professor Bill Richardson, Professor Sarah Bidop, and Dr. Karen Taylor, Mr. Daphne Wu, and for the very effective collaboration in organizing this conference. We feel very fortunate to have a chance to cooperate with you in this project, and we have actually learned a lot from you, from the personal wisdom, from the responsibility, from the dedication to work, and we very hope to continue to collaborate with you in organizing other conferences in the future. Once again, thank you very much, you all, and I wish you all good health, happiness, and success. Thank you very much.